But we will talk about process between science and innovation. And also, there will be a focus with this word excellent, quote unquote, with the quality issue. This quality issue was mentioned for patents, and I'm very much going to talk about it for publications, scientific publications. The outline of my presentation is the following. I'll spend some time on my motivation from a policy perspective, and then I'll turn to the other aspects based on, I must say, very much the economics of science literature. So the motivation is about what are policymakers using for to design their policies in terms of evidence, and in particular for research and innovation policy. I'm afraid the microphone is. But you hear me, right? Okay.
No, but they are filming, maybe. Oh,
okay, is it okay because it's falling? And I will be at the EU level for this. So you have a quote here from the Science, Research and Innovation Performance of the EU report, the latest one this year. And here you read something: Europe is the world's largest producer of high-quality scientific research, and yet its innovation performance remains far below its potential. This is the Research and Innovation Commissioner doing this, but I'm pretty sure for the Europeans in the room that you're familiar with this idea, that Europe is very good at science, but it's not very good at innovation. And I would like to discuss this. This is from the same publication, the same report, and this is showing that Europe is good at producing science, right? World share of the top 1% most cited publication. So Europe has a very large share of these publications here. It has an even larger share of publications in general. But here we are focusing on what is sometimes used as an indicator of this excellent science. But what I'd like to emphasize here is that this is a size-dependent indicator, because you take the entire set of publications, then you look at those that are among the 1% most cited by other scientific publications, but it depends also on the size of the population you're looking at. I'd like to contrast this with this indicator. We are not on the number of those highly cited publications, but on the proportion of those publications in each country's publications. So it's more an indicator of the intensity of those publications in what each country produces. And here you have the US, EU next, and China next in terms of the larger producer. And you see that the relative position of the EU and the US is quite different. Here, 1% is the average of the world. We are looking at the 1% most cited publications. So the US is, let's say, 65% above the world average, and the EU is 10% above the world average. So here you have a different type of indicator, a size-independent type of indicator. And in terms of excellence, this is quite important to make the difference, because, as you know, the EU in terms of population, for example, is larger than the US. I'd like to show you another piece of policy-related EU document that some of you may know. It's a report that was commissioned by the European Commissioner in 2017 on the way to the next framework program and how should we proceed, what types of instrument, etc. And you find again this type of citation at the very beginning of this report, that Europe is good at science, but there is a striking difference because we're not so good at innovation. And the next part of the citation suggests that this is a major problem for growth in Europe. So again, we have the same types of starting point for this policy document. And the evidence, this figure, is right below the citation that I just showed you. And so it is provided as evidence of this contrast between our position, our standing, EU standing in terms of science versus innovation. Whoop, I did something wrong. Okay. Well, something is not working, but it's not very important. So here I have worked on this figure that you just showed, and I've added a number of things. But maybe I'll come back. Excuse me, because maybe you've not read the legend here shows the position of the US as 1. It has been normalized as 1 for each of these indicators. And so you have the relative position of the EU in purple. And so what you see is that on the right, you have indicators of scientific position, and on the left, indicators of innovation position. So what the figure says is more or less what the quotation was saying, that relatively to the US, the EU is in a better position in science, but not in innovation. Now I'd like to discuss this figure with my next slide. I have divided science and innovation on left and right. But what you see is that the scientific indicators are size dependent, while the innovation indicators are size independent. And it seems to me that in terms of methods, it's not right to compare indicators in this way. So what I've done is that I have corrected the size-dependent indicator to transform them into size-independent indicators. So for the first one, the very first indicator we saw, world share of scientific publications, I have corrected this with the world share of population. And so the relative position of Europe, you see, is changed from 1.4 to 0.9. World share of highly cited publications, which was already below the US, but if you correct for size, the second figure I showed you, the proportion of excellent papers, then you are down to 0.7. And then the last one is really weird because you have on the right side, it's the same type of, notion, researchers, but on one side you correct it for size and on the other you don't. So if you now redraw the figure, you see that the relative position of the EU is actually for both publications and innovation below the US. So I think that this is quite important to read the indicators, because actually even the EU data, the EU reports, they don't support this notion that we are better at science and innovation, which has been for about 2 decades in the EU literature, and it has a name actually. It was labeled as the European paradox. And what this very simple, I mean, it could, we would need to go further, but this very simple data shows that there is no such thing as a European paradox based on a number of data. So this is the motivation for what I'm going to tell you about. And it's an important question, I think, for policy design to know indeed if innovation depends on the volume of scientific production, even excellent scientific production, or whether we need some intensity of that production to generate innovation and to stimulate innovation-based growth. And so now I turn to the economics of science, economic literature, to support this idea that actually excellent research has both an impact on science, on the advancement of science, but also on innovation, and that there is no gap or contradiction between being good, very good at science, and good at innovation. So I have two parts. This one is on countries, institutions, and individuals, and then I'll go to the publication level in the next part. So this is a very simplified presentation of the process of the relationship between academic research and innovation. One element in the system that was mentioned previously, we talked about firms, etc. But in this issue of technological transfer, it's well identified that researchers, in order to have the intangible coming from with their ideas, they have to engage in some way in that transfer. And so a number of policies to stimulate transfer and innovation have focused on this step, how to engage more researchers, how to give them time, to support them with specific services, to write patents, whatever. What the literature on these issues shows is that, to measure economic engagement, you can count the contract research, you can count patents, by startup creation, we've talked about this, by academics. But what is neglected very often in this way of seeing things is that research excellence has also an impact on economic engagement and researchers, the engagement of whole units. Here, excellence is measured by project research funds, bibliometric indicators, or the national evaluation process. There is, I wouldn't say an enormous literature, but there is an empirical literature on these issues. And whether you measure excellence by these different indicators at the researchers unit, even for in some cases institutional unit or individual unit, you find that the excellent researchers, based on their academic record, tend also to engage in commercial activities or contract research, and it's not there is no divide between those researchers who would spend a lot of time with economic engagement and have low academic record, and those who would be very good on the academic record and not engage. This is not what the literature says. I would add a word in relation with a little bit with the previous panel, but I have no time really to talk about it, is this context of open innovation that was a little bit mentioned in the previous panel. There are also conditions for the success on the firm side with this tech transfer cooperation, public-private cooperation, that is the absorptive capacity of the companies. And here again, the absorptive capacity of the companies means that the company is somewhat involved with academics, sometimes even with publishing, and that the better they are, also they have a better aptitude to identify the good academics, and so the system is also supply and demand on this issue. So I'll go relatively quickly here. And so I turn to the second set of evidence, I think, which I find very interesting, and it seems to me at the frontier of what is being done in this field. And so I will essentially base my talk here on this publication, which is relatively recent. So here we are at the level of the publication, individual publications and individual patents. So what the authors have been doing is that they've been tracing the relationships through citations between patents and scientific publication. As you see, their sample is very large and spans a long period of time. So what they have identified is what they call the paper-patent boundary. So that's when a patent directly cites a scientific article in its text, and it's a quite classical way to try to trace the impact of those ideas in the scientific publications to the patent. Again, the patent here being taken as an indicator of innovation, of new technology, potentially leading to innovation on the market, as we saw in the previous panel. And what they further do, because this has been done in a number of academic papers, but what they further do is the indirect relationship between a scientific paper being cited by another paper and eventually being cited by a patent. So what they do, in a way, is they try to trace the ideas as input into patent. And so what they determine is a distance between a paper and a patent. And so they have a whole set of relations being drawn this way with their distance, this D characteristic, and they relate this with different technologies, scientific disciplines, institutions, because of course in the publications and in the patents you can identify the authors, where they are, etc. So this is a very rich then set of result through which they are navigating and get to, I think, very interesting conclusions. So the first result on this slide is that 60% of patents make references to scientific paper through that networks, and 80% of the papers with at least one citation. This is a non-trivial condition because, as you probably know, the papers' citations are very asymmetrical. So a lot of papers are never cited, like a lot of patents are never used. But so this is similar. But so the condition that they have at least one citation is a real condition. But in that case, ultimately they can be traced. They have some influence on a patent. So you see this web of relationship through papers. Here we are not anymore through people. The previous idea here that it goes through people is different. But we'll come back to that. So it's including without this direct link. And yet, at the boundary, there is still a lot of a substantial connection, but you see that most of those connections are indeed indirect. The second slide on this paper is, of course, I mean, that was to be expected. There are large differences among technologies and among disciplines. We already saw this in the first panel, and it is very clear in the data too. I mean, some technologies are very close to this scientific distribution, so the distance is very short, but it's much longer for other disciplines. And it's related in the paper, they discuss this, to the notion of the delay. What is the time for a mathematical paper to influence a patent? It's very long. But it can be much shorter in fundamental biology, for example. And another very important result, it seems to me, and relates to what I was saying previously, is that those papers and patents that are closely connected in their own field, they are important. Those papers are more cited by other papers, and those patents are more cited by other patents. And so we have, again, this idea of the dual impact. And the last point, I go quickly here, 55% of university patents cited a paper written by an individual with the same name. So here we find again those individuals that are engaged on both sides and that in the literature are assimilated to Pasteur because he is a historical example of this dual engagement in both fundamental science, academic activity, and also direct impact on health and entrepreneur in science in a way. So this does exist, and this is identified by this work, but you see that it's a subset of the whole story. I mentioned here other research because right now there is a lot of activity to identify novelty indicators in scientific papers. That is, the idea is to try to find those papers who are novel in their field that really bring, because I mean science is an activity, you have incremental science, but the idea is to identify, to have indicators of those novel papers, for example, bringing two subdisciplines together or this sort of thing. And again, here we see that, well, there are different types of indicators, but that there is a connection between novelty, scientific impact, and also citation of those novel papers in patents. So again, there is this complementarity between understanding and use or impact rather than sometimes what is portrayed as a gap or as a very different type of contributions. Conclusion for policy design. I'll come back to that report from the European Commission. That report had a number of recommendations, but one of those recommendations was to design the next European program for greater impact. So now we have this notion that research funding should target research that is going to have high social and economic impact. But behind what is being proposed is that the three pillars of the program, here you have the existing EU program, that they would maybe have different names. That excellent science will not be excellent science anymore, that it should be focused on science and skills. So that should be, we can guess, ERC. The next one would be innovation and competitiveness, so EIC, the European Innovation Council, the idea of the commissioner to have a similar, something similar to ERC, but yet we don't know exactly what. And then global challenges with this notion of missions. And it seems to me that this recommendation, as well as other policy speeches on the next program, neglect what I've tried to show, this strong connection between scientific impact, excellent research, and innovation, the capacity of Europe and European countries to have a stronger performance in innovation. Thank you.